Maybe Belarus is about to betray Putin. In fact, in recent months, Lukashenko has started using a very different language than usual and has begun to talk about compromise. He even said that a complete victory doesn't seem realistic for either Russia or Ukraine. And then he also assured that Kiev doesn't need to fear attacks from Belarus. And this is despite the fact that in 2022, Minsk allowed Russia to use its territory to invade Ukraine and take Kyiv. That operation, as is well known, failed. But now Lukashenko seems more afraid of being dragged into war against Kyiv than of Putin. And mind you, Lukashenko is a dictator who is first and foremost interested in his own survival. And so this tells us that he may have realized that Russia is no longer a guarantee of security but a risk to the stability of his regime, especially if it drags Belarus into the conflict. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Lukashenko has been ruling Belarus for more than 3 decades and has never had a great relationship with the West. But after the crackdown on protests against the results of the 2020 Belarusian presidential elections and against the regime's violence toward its opponents, his isolation from the West increased even more. But the greatest distance came in 2022 when Belarus allowed Putin to use its territory to invade Ukraine, and the West responded with new sanctions against both Moscow and Minsk. And at that point, Putin became a sort of lifeline for Lukashenko, because Moscow could offer economic support and protection. And in fact, Belarus depends on the Kremlin for low-cost energy, loans, and military deterrence. Just think, in 2023, Lukashenko even agreed to host Russian tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. Meanwhile, in May 2026, Belarus started exercises involving Russian nuclear weapons, with activities related to preparing for their possible use. However, this dependence only works as long as Russia appears strong and capable of protecting its allies. If Russia loses military credibility, Lukashenko's relationship with Moscow could become a vulnerability. In a recent interview, Lukashenko said Russia and Ukraine should do everything possible to reach a peace agreement, even if it means making compromises. Because moving forward could lead to a worse escalation. But above all, he said that a victory on the battlefield doesn't seem realistic for either side, so not even for his ally. However, be careful. Lukashenko isn't saying Moscow is wrong, but he's stopped using Russian propaganda language. Now he speaks as someone worried the situation could spiral out of control. Then Lukashenko also said that Ukraine would have nothing to fear from Belarus, an interesting statement, even though in reality Kyiv has every reason not to trust Minsk, after what happened in 2022. The Russians and Belarusians would never announce an attack in advance. Before the 2022 invasion, the Kremlin also denied any plans for a large-scale war. But beyond this, the contrast with 2022 is huge, because Belarus, which was in fact a co-belligerent country, now seems to want to avoid at all costs being dragged down together with Putin. And for the Kremlin, any distancing by Minsk, no matter how small, is very bad news. Also because Belarus is a strategic territory that borders Ukraine to the south and Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, that is 3 NATO countries, to the west. For Russia, this means having an ally in one of the most sensitive areas of Europe. And in fact, in 2022, this position made Belarus useful for attacking Ukraine, and Lukashenko's regime was more than fine with this. But the failure of the Russian advance toward the Ukrainian capital changed everything. Because if in 2022 Putin could use Belarus against the Ukraine he imagined to be weak, by 2026 Lukashenko is facing a much stronger Ukraine with military experience and above all, the ability to strike deep. And Lukashenko seems aware of this change. In the earlier interview, he said expanding the war into Belarus would be unacceptable and explained his country would be highly vulnerable if Ukraine attacked it as it does Russia. He also referred to as many as 500 sensitive targets that the Ukrainians had reportedly already identified on Belarusian territory. Targets that would likely be attacked immediately if Minsk were to become directly involved in the war. Of course, from the Russian point of view, involving Minsk could put pressure on Ukraine and force Kiev to shift resources to the north. But Lukashenko knows the Belarusian army lacks the Ukrainians' experience. In addition, Ukraine has also fortified its northern border with anti-tank ditches, concrete obstacles, and barbed wire precisely because it doesn't trust Belarus. This means that any possible new attack from the north wouldn't have the same surprise effect as in 2022. The 2022 attack failed anyway despite the surprise, so imagine now. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that Lukashenko also said that if Russia were to attack Kyiv again from Belarusian territory, the front line would extend for about 1,500 kilometers along the border between Belarus and Ukraine. According to him, neither the Belarusians nor the Russians could defend that part of the front. In other words, Lukashenko doubts Russia could defend Belarus from Ukraine. But we also have to say that rationally, it might be more convenient for Russia if Belarus stays out of the direct conflict. For Moscow, it's more useful to have a friendly territory as a rear base and pressure platform than to make it another front and target for Ukrainian drones. Also, since the Belarusian army is much weaker than the Ukrainian one, it would likely only be helpful briefly. However, these moves by Lukashenko are actually highlighting Russia's fragility. In desperate situations, it might actually be tempted by the idea of using the Belarusian army to force Kiev to spread its forces and maybe take the opportunity to increase pressure in the east. Because even if it's weak, if the Belarusian army were to attack Ukraine from the north, Kiev would still be forced to move many more troops north to protect the capital and the entire northern front rather than the eastern front. And so Putin could take advantage of this at the same time to push in the east, basically sacrificing the Belarusians to try to break through in the Donbass. And it's clear that Minsk is trying to get ahead of this to avoid that scenario. The fact is that Kiev doesn't consider the Belarusian issue closed, and Zelensky said that Russia is still trying to drag Belarus into the war. However, there is currently no evidence of large Russian or Belarusian forces preparing to repeat the 2022 invasion. But the fear of an increasing involvement of Belarus in the conflict still exists. And the problem for Lukashenko is also that he doesn't know at what level of Belarusian involvement Kiev might decide to intervene in Belarus. This is also likely why he is trying to distance himself from Putin's war. In short, for Lukashenko, this is a trap. If he opposes Putin too much, he risks losing Russian support and economic collapse. But if he accepts too many of Moscow's demands, Belarus could become a target for Ukrainian drones. And that's why he hopes as much as possible for a compromise that will end the conflict or at least freeze it. But can Putin really allow Belarus to drift away from Moscow? Probably not, because without Minsk, Russia would lose its strategic depth in Europe. In fact, Belarus allows Moscow to keep pressure on Ukraine from the north and to project influence toward NATO territories. So if Lukashenko really started to distance himself even slowly and ambiguously, it would be a huge blow for Putin, both politically and strategically. This is also why Moscow has many military assets in Belarus and has worked hard to keep Minsk closely tied from a military defense perspective. The more Russia uses Belarus as a military base, the more Belarus is seen by Kiev as part of the threat. As Minsk becomes more of a threat, the risk of Belarusian territory getting involved in the conflict increases. So Putin can use nuclear weapons and military exercises to keep Lukashenko close, but this doesn't solve the underlying problem. Above all, Russia can keep Belarus tied to it only while it has the resources and credibility. Both of these are things that the war of attrition with Ukraine is depleting, and as if that weren't enough, now Lukashenko also seems to be making overtures to the Americans in a way. In fact, in March 2026, Lukashenko released 250 prisoners while the United States agreed to lift sanctions on 2 Belarusian banks and on the finance minister. They clarified that this must not enable sanction evasion or aid Belarus's war effort in Ukraine. Lukashenko therefore made some concessions regarding the prisoners and in return sought economic benefits. Not because he has changed, but because he needs more room to maneuver now that his main protector, Russia, seems less solid than ever. And Lukashenko, among other things, also reportedly said that he does not rule out a meeting with Trump, specifying, however, that in any such meeting, the discussion should not be limited to the issue of releasing prisoners. And this is important to mention because it tells us that Lukashenko probably wants to turn humanitarian issues into leverage for negotiating with the West, and above all, to make himself less dependent on Russia. In short, Lukashenko's possible betrayal of Putin should not be seen as a complete break with Moscow. The betrayal will be slow and ambiguous if it happens, with less willingness to follow Putin all the way, more attempts at dialogue with the West, and more caution not to turn Belarus into a target. Because Lukashenko can't afford a direct break with Moscow, his regime needs Russia, and Russia still has the means to influence Minsk. However, precisely because the relationship is so close, every sign of distancing needs to be analyzed. And here comes the paradox for Russia. In fact, Moscow wanted to show that it is still a superpower and can dominate the entire post-Soviet space. But after years of war, it is achieving the opposite effect. The closest allies are beginning to see Russia as a source of instability. Think of Azerbaijan and Armenia, while others have completely collapsed. Think of Assad's Syria, while other countries have moved closer and closer to NATO. Think, for example, of Finland and Sweden. After the invasion of Ukraine, they even joined the Atlantic Alliance. Not to mention the real weapons. In your opinion, will Lukashenko remain loyal to Russia, or will he try to distance himself from Putin? Let me know in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Bye!